The colder the lake, the fewer people would come to the shore, and Lieutenant Sera Callahan had counted on exactly that. The wind off Lake Superior did not ask permission. It tore through the tree line at the edge of the property with the kind of violence that felt personal, bending the birches sideways, driving ice crystals into every gap between the logs of the old fishing cabin that Sera Callahan had bought with 8 months of hazard pay and 0 intention of ever leaving. The cabin sat at the end of a gravel road that stopped being a road about 1 kilometre before it reached her door. The nearest town was Wawa, Ontario, 40 minutes south on a good day, longer on a January morning when the highway glazed over before the plows ever got there. Sera hadn't been to town in 11 days. She knew because Ghost had eaten through the last of the kibble on day 10, and she'd melted snow in a stockpot and mixed it with canned salmon from her emergency supply, the kind meant for people, not dogs. Ghost had eaten it without complaint, which told her everything she needed to know about that dog's character, and also about the state of her own planning. Ghost was a Belgian Malinois, 7 years old, retired from the Royal Canadian Navy 2 years before Sera herself had been. He'd been her partner for 4 of those years. Before him, there had been Sable, and before Sable there had been Coda. Each one had come home from a different theatre, carrying different kinds of invisible weight. But Ghost was the one who'd come home with her from Kandahar, from the 12-hour stretch, in a collapsed building on the outskirts of a village, whose name she'd tried very hard to forget and couldn't. He was the one who'd pulled her out by her vest strap when the secondary collapse came. He was the reason she had 2 functioning legs and a rib cage that had healed almost straight. When the Navy had discharged Ghost with honors, the paperwork had gone through Sera's commanding officer, and the CO had looked at her across his desk and said, "He's going to need someone who understands him." Sera had said, "I know." That had been the entirety of the conversation. Now Ghost lay on the hooked rug in front of the wood stove, his chin on his forepaws, watching her with those pale amber eyes that seemed to catch the firelight and hold it longer than anything else in the room. He tracked her every movement, when she rose to add a log, when she sat back down at the table with her coffee, when she crossed to the window and stood there for a long moment, looking at nothing. He didn't follow her, he didn't need to. In any room, in any silence, Ghost always knew where she was. That was the arrangement. That was the whole of the arrangement. The satellite phone on the shelf above the wood stove had a charge indicator that Sera checked twice a day out of habit, not hope. Her sister Elena had called 3 weeks ago, and Sera had let it ring 7 times before answering, and the conversation had lasted 4 minutes because there had been nothing either of them could say that didn't end in the same silence. Elena lived in Halifax. She had a husband and 2 kids and a kitchen that always smelled like garlic bread, and every time she called, Sera could hear all of it in the background: the TV, the kids fighting over something, a chair scraping across tile, and it made her chest feel like a fist was closing around it. She wasn't angry at Elena. She wasn't angry at anyone. That would have been easier. She was just outside of it. Outside of all of it. Like someone had taken her out of the current and set her on the bank, and she kept watching everyone else move downstream and couldn't remember how to get back in. Ghost lifted his head when she moved to the window the second time. "Easy," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. She hadn't spoken aloud since. She tried to count backward and couldn't pin it down. 2 days, maybe. 3. Ghost put his chin back on his forepaws. The woodpile was getting low. She could see that much through the frost-blurred glass. The stack she'd split in October, which had seemed like more than enough, had turned out to be exactly enough for a person who didn't move around much and whose body heat was mostly ambient. She'd need to get more. She'd need to make the drive to Wawa, or at least the call to the guy up on Route 17, who split and delivered in half-cord lots for $60. She had his number written on the inside cover of the notebook she used for nothing else. She hadn't called him. She hadn't called anyone. The first morning she woke up and couldn't feel her hands. She thought it was the cold. The cabin temperature had dropped in the night, and she'd let the fire go lower than she should have, and she lay in the sleeping bag for 10 minutes, telling herself that was all it was. Ghost was pressed against her legs, which was new. He'd always slept at the foot of the bed. Giving her space, and the fact that he'd moved up without her noticing unsettled her in a way she didn't have words for. She got up. She rebuilt the fire. She made coffee and stood at the stove and waited for the feeling to come back. It didn't come back the way it should have. By mid-morning, when she tried to split the last of the logs from the side pile, the axe slipped twice on downswings that she should have controlled easily. Her grip wasn't right. Her depth perception was doing something odd. The woodblock kept looking closer than it was, then farther. She set the axe down against the cabin wall and stood in the snow, with her face turned up into the cold, and breathed, and Ghost stood beside her, with his shoulder against her thigh, and didn't make a sound. "I'm fine," she told him. His tail didn't move. She made it back inside, and she sat at the table, and she told herself it was dehydration. She'd been living on coffee and canned goods for 2 weeks, and she hadn't been sleeping properly, and her body was just filing a complaint through the only channels it had available. She would drink water. She would eat something actual. She would be fine by morning. She wasn't fine by morning. She woke on the floor. She didn't know when she'd gotten there or how long she'd been down. The fire was nearly out. Ghost was on his feet, pacing. She could hear him. 3 steps one way, turn, 3 steps back, and when she tried to push herself upright, her arms gave out in a way that frightened her more than anything had frightened her since the building came down. The satellite phone was on the shelf. The shelf was, how far? She measured it in her head. 6-7 meters. It might as well have been across the lake. She pulled herself to the wood stove first because it was closer, because if the fire went out, she was dead well before any other problem mattered, and she pushed 2 logs in with hands that weren't responding the way they should. Splinters. She didn't feel them. She noticed them later, but she didn't feel them then. Ghost came and stood in front of her. He didn't make a sound. He looked at her, and the look said, "Something." Something she was too far gone to translate. "Go," she said. The word came out garbled. She tried again. "Ghost." "Stay." He stayed. Of course he stayed. He would always stay. It took her 22 minutes to cross the cabin. She timed it later, when she had a working mind again, reconstructing the sequence of events like a debrief. 22 minutes to cover 7 meters. She pulled herself along the floor on her forearms like she was back in training, like she was under wire in the Meaford exercises at 19 years old, and too stubborn to give up. The floor was cold under her palms. Ghost walked beside her the whole way, matching her pace, never pulling ahead. She got the phone. She got it, and she looked at the contact list, and her vision was doing something terrible, and the only number she could read without her eyes sliding off the screen was the one at the top. Elena. She pressed it. She said. She wasn't sure what she said. Later, Elena would tell her it was mostly the sound of breathing, and one word, Ghost. Just the one word. The dog's name, maybe, or a request, or just the one thing her brain had managed to hold on to. Elena had called 911 before the call disconnected. She'd given them Sarah's address from memory. Sera had insisted on that, on Elena knowing the address, and it was the one thing in the previous 11 months that had been an actual good decision. The crew from Wawa took 43 minutes to reach the cabin. Ghost did not let them in. That was the first problem. He stood at the door, not barking, which would have been manageable. He stood absolutely still, which was much worse. The 2 paramedics from Wawa General had protocol for aggressive animals, and protocol required distance and waiting for animal control, and animal control was another 40 minutes south, and Sera Callahan did not have 80 minutes. The crew supervisor, a man named Brent Tulloch, who had 17 years on the job and had handled most of the things the Northern Ontario bush had ever thrown at him, stood on the porch and talked to the dog for 6 minutes through the door glass. Ghost watched him with those amber eyes and did not move. "Is there someone who can get him to stand down?" Tulloch called into his radio. There wasn't anyone. There wasn't anyone because Sera had made sure of it. They were on the radio with Wawa General when the truck came up the road. It came from the wrong direction, from the north, not the south, not from town, and the sound of it on the gravel reached them before the headlights did. An old Tacoma, dark green, moving with the careful speed of someone who knew the road. It stopped behind the ambulance, and the door opened, and the person who got out was not what any of them had expected. She was young, mid-20s at most, in a down jacket that had seen better winters and work boots that had definitely seen better seasons. She had her hood down in the cold, as if she hadn't thought to pull it up, and she was looking at the cabin with an expression that the paramedics couldn't quite read from where they were standing. Her name was Petra Landvik. She was a veterinary technician out of Chaplow who did house calls for farms in the area during the winter months when the roads allowed, and sometimes when they didn't. Brent Tulloch didn't know her. Neither did anyone on the crew. She had come, she explained, in a voice that was very steady and very quiet, the way people get when they're holding something carefully, because she'd heard the radio traffic on her scanner while she was doing an early call at a farm 12 kilometers up Route 17, and she'd recognized the address. She didn't say how she recognized it. Not then. She walked up to the porch, and she looked at Ghost through the door glass, and Ghost looked at her. "Let me try," she said. Tulloch said, "Ma'am, he's not." She had already put her hand flat on the door glass. Ghost went still in a different way. The rigid guarding stillness left his body like water draining from a basin, and what replaced it was something more complicated. He took one step back, and his head lowered, and his ears, which had been forward and hard, went soft. She said one word, just one. She said it quietly. And the paramedics later would disagree about exactly what it was. Tulloch thought she said a name, and his partner thought it was a command in a language neither of them recognized. And in the end it didn't matter because the door unlocked from the inside, and Ghost stepped back, and Petra Landvik walked into the cabin. She went straight to Sera, who was on the floor beside the woodstove, and she did something that Tulloch found very strange later when he thought about it. She didn't assess the patient first. She put her hand on the side of Sera's face, and she said, "I've got you. They're coming in now." And then she looked at Ghost and said, quiet and steady, "Guard." Ghost sat down. The paramedics came through the door. Wawa General was not a large hospital. It had 42 beds and a trauma bay that doubled as a procedure room, and 3 nurses on overnight who knew each other well enough to finish each other's sentences. Sera Callahan arrived at 6:47 in the morning in a state of septic shock that the attending physician, Dr. Amara Osi, described in her notes as severe and rapidly progressing. The infection had likely been building for 4 or 5 days, a cut on Sera's left palm, hidden under a work glove, and ignored in the way that Sera apparently ignored most things that inconvenienced her, had gone unnoticed and untreated until her immune system had simply run out of road. Ghost was not allowed in the hospital. This presented a practical problem that the nursing staff debated for approximately 3 minutes before Petra Landvik solved it by sitting in the ambulance bay with him, which was outside, technically, and therefore not in the hospital, and which Ghost accepted with the air of a dog who understood rules and was prepared to observe the letter of them while completely violating their spirit. Sera didn't know any of this for a long time. She drifted in and out for the first day and a half. She knew, in the way you know things in fever, not clearly but with strange certainty, that she was somewhere warm and that there were people nearby, and that Ghost was not one of them. That last fact moved through her like cold water, and she kept surfacing to ask about him, or trying to, though the nurses told her later that what she actually said was not always recognizable as language. Dr. OC came in on the second morning when Sera was more present than she'd been, and stood at the foot of the bed with her arms crossed and looked at her patient with an expression that contained several things at once. "The infection is responding," she said. "You're going to be here for a minimum of 5 days, likely 7, Sera said. "Ghost, the dog is fine. He's being managed. He doesn't get managed. He doesn't allow. He's being managed," Dr. Ose said again, with the firm patience of someone who had already dealt with Ghost and had opinions. "There's a young woman from Chaplow who seems to have some kind of arrangement with him. We're not asking questions." Sera was quiet for a moment. Her hands were in her lap, both of them threaded with IV lines, and there were splinters in her left palm that a nurse had spent 20 minutes removing the previous night, one by one, while Sera had felt none of it. She was starting to feel things now. That was its own kind of information. "Who is she?" Sera asked. "The woman from Chaplow." Dr. Ose's expression shifted in a way that was too small to read. "She said she'd come explain when you were ready," the doctor said. "I'll let her know." Petra Landvik came in on the afternoon of the 3rd day, when the fever had finally broken, and Sera was upright against the pillows and had eaten about half a bowl of broth that she had no appetite for, but forced down out of long-practiced discipline. She came in quietly, the way she seemed to do everything, and she pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down without asking, and she put her hands on her knees and looked at Sera directly. She looked like someone who had been thinking about this moment for a while. "You don't know me," she said. "I know you got Ghost to stand down," Sera said. "I've been trying to figure out how." Petra was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone avoiding, the quiet of someone deciding how to begin. "My brother was Elias Landvik," she said. The name landed in Sera's chest like something physical. She knew that name. She would always know that name. It lived in the part of her that she'd moved to a cabin in the northern Ontario bush to keep very still and very quiet. The part that woke her up at 2 a.m. and played the sequence back in a loop until she got up and sat in the dark and waited for it to stop. Elias Landvik had been her spotter in Kandahar. He'd been 26 years old and from Chaplow, Ontario, a fact Sera had known and had filed away and had never thought about in the context of the town 40 kilometers from where she'd chosen to buy a cabin. Or told herself she'd never thought about it. She wasn't sure anymore what was true and what was the story she'd needed. Elias had gone down in the same building she had. He had not come out of it. Ghost had come out. Sera had come out. Elias had not. She had written the letter to his family. She had written 5 drafts before she had anything she could send. And she had sent the 5th one, knowing it was not adequate, knowing nothing she could put on paper would ever be adequate. Because what had happened in that building was not a thing that words had been built to carry. She hadn't received a reply. She had not expected one. "I know you tried to get him out," Petra said. Her voice was level. She was not crying and she didn't look like she was going to cry, and that steadiness undid something in Sera more than tears would have. "I know because I've spent 2 years looking at the reports and the testimonies and talking to everyone who would talk to me. I know what you did." Sera's jaw was tight. "I didn't get him out. You went back in twice. I didn't get him out." Petra didn't argue with that. She sat with it for a moment, and then she said, "Ghost was Elias's dog first." Sera had known that. Of course she'd known that. The 3 of them had worked together for 8 months before the reassignment that had put Ghost with Sera for the last 4. She had known it, and she had carried it, and she had moved to a cabin on Lake Superior and bought 30 years of firewood in her head and planned to stay there until something decided she didn't need to anymore. "Elias talked about him in every letter," Petra said. "He said Ghost was the best dog he'd ever worked with and also the most professionally inconvenient because he didn't respect rank, he only respected competence." A small sound, not quite a laugh but the shape of one. That sounded exactly like Elias. Something in Sera's chest cracked along a line that had been there a long time. When I heard the radio traffic, Petra said, I saw the address and She stopped. She looked at her hands on her knees. I knew you'd moved here. My mother found out, I don't know how. Word travels in small towns. I drove past the road twice last winter, but I didn't go up. I didn't know what I would say. You didn't come to say anything, Sera said. You came because of Ghost. Petra looked up. No, she said. I came because my brother trusted you with everything he had, and you came home carrying it, and I didn't want you carrying it alone anymore. The room was very quiet. Down the hall, a cart went by with a sound of wheels on linoleum. Someone laughed at the nursing station. A short, bright sound, ordinary and oblivious and entirely separate from what was happening in this room. Sera said, I should have gotten him out. Yes, Petra said, simply without cruelty. And you went back twice. And you couldn't. And Ghost came home. And you carried him home. And you've been living on a mountain trying to disappear because you're the one who made it and he didn't. She held Sera's gaze. I know, all of it. I'm still here. There was no clean moment of release. There was no single thing that broke open and resolved. There was just the fact of another person in the room who knew the whole shape of it and had come anyway. Not to demand anything, not to forgive anything, not to fix anything, but just to sit in the room and say, I know, and I'm still here. Ghost had known her. That was what Sera kept returning to, over the days that followed. Ghost had known Petra Landvik the moment she put her hand on that door glass, because Ghost had known Elias, and Elias had come from the same house, the same family, the same smell that dogs carry in their memories longer than people do. The word she'd said through the glass, the word that had made him stand down, was Elias's call sign, the one he'd used with Ghost in the 8 months before the reassignment. The word the paramedics couldn't agree on later because neither of them had ever had reason to know it. Petra had written it down in a notebook 2 years ago. She'd asked everyone who'd known her brother, in his unit, in his letters, in his recorded mission notes, and she'd compiled everything because that was the kind of person she was. She had not been building a case. She had been building a portrait. She had been refusing to let him be just an absence. When Sera was released from Wawa General on day 6, 1 day ahead of Dr. Osi's conservative estimate, which the doctor noted with visible reluctance, Petra was in the lobby with Ghost on a lead. He was sitting perfectly still beside her right leg in the regulation position, and when Sera came through the doors and stopped, he held the sit for exactly 3 seconds before he broke it and came to her. Not running, not frantic, but steady, with the deliberate certainty of a dog who had been waiting and knew the waiting was over. She put both hands in the fur at his neck and stayed there for a long time. Petra handed her the lead when she straightened up. I called the guy on Route 17, she said. He's delivering a cord and a half on Saturday. Sera looked at her. You don't have enough wood, Petra said. You had maybe 4 days left. You went up to my cabin. Ghost knows the way. She said it simply, without apology. Also, you were unconscious, and someone needed to lock it. Outside, the January light was doing what January light did in Wawa, cutting low and pale through the trees, making everything look both sharper and further away than it was. The parking lot was half ice, half packed snow, and their breath came out in visible clouds, and Ghost pressed his shoulder against Sera's leg in the way he had been pressing against her leg for the past 2 days, which she was beginning to understand was not just habit. Why Chaplow? Sera asked, after a while. You've been in Chaplow this whole time. It's home, Petra said. Elias always said he was going to go back after. He didn't, so I did. There was a long pause between them, the kind that didn't need filling. He talked about you, Petra said then. Not a setup, not a lead-in, just a fact, delivered plainly, the way her brother had apparently delivered most things. He said you were the most stubborn person he'd ever worked with, and that was exactly why he trusted you. Sera said nothing. He was right about the stubborn part, Petra said. A sound came out of Sera then. It surprised her. It had been a long time since anything had surprised her from the inside. She looked out at the pale January light on the parking lot. She looked at Ghost, who looked back at her with those amber eyes that held the light longer than anything else and gave nothing away except everything, if you knew how to read him. She had come to Lake Superior to be outside of it, outside of the current, on the bank, watching everyone else move downstream. She had built a perimeter of firewood and gravel road and 11-day silences, and told herself it was the only way the weight could be managed. But the weight didn't get lighter alone. She was beginning to understand that. She had understood it before, and forgotten it, and maybe was only now remembering. The way you remember some things only when you are lying on a cold floor with a dog pressing his warm weight against your leg, waiting for you to get up. Saturday, Sera said. The wood delivery. Saturday, Petra confirmed. You could come up, Sera said. If you want, you could come up and see the cabin. Petra looked at her for a moment. There was nothing dramatic in her face, just a kind of careful steadiness, the same steadiness she'd had on the porch in the dark at 6 a.m., with the paramedics watching. Okay, she said. Ghost's tail moved once. Just once. But Sera felt it against her leg, and she reached down and put her hand on his back, and the three of them stood there in the cold white light of a January morning in Wawa, Ontario, and the perimeter very slowly began to come down.